14 kilometers. That is the entire distance separating the continent of Europe from the continent of Africa at the Strait of Gibraltar. To put that in physical terms, you could drive it in 11 minutes at highway speed. You could row it in a long afternoon. On a clear day, standing on the Spanish coast near Tarifa, you can see Morocco with the naked eye. The Atlas Mountains rising on the horizon like a faint watercolor wash. And yet, in the entire recorded history of human civilization, through the Roman Empire, the age of exploration, to world wars, the space age, and the era of tunnel-boring machines powerful enough to cut through solid granite, not one bridge has been built here. Not one tunnel. Not one fixed crossing of any kind. 14 kilometers, the most uncrossed 14 kilometers on Earth. The question is not why engineers haven't tried. They have for over a century. The question is what they found when they looked down. Hit that subscribe button. This goes deeper than any documentary you've seen. Don't gamble on finding this again. What you are about to follow is not a story about political failure or lack of funding. This is a story about geology fighting back. The standard explanation frames this as an engineering challenge. Difficult currents, deep water, long distance, technically accurate, profoundly incomplete. When marine engineers conducted detailed seismic surveys of the strait floor in the late 20th century, they discovered something that reframed the entire project. The shortest crossing is not merely deep. It is broken, sitting directly above a canyon carved by two tectonic plates that are still moving toward each other at this moment. We will trace the full arc of that discovery, from the earliest proposals and their failures, through the most delusional engineering concept of the 20th century, to the fault line that permanently changed the analysis. And we will arrive at the one route that survives every geological objection, 28 kilometers west of the obvious choice. Built on a ridge, the ocean almost hides. What comes next in the first 2 minutes is the specific fact that stopped the earliest serious engineering study called. The floor of the Strait of Gibraltar at its narrowest point drops to nearly 900 meters deeper than the Eiffel Tower stacked twice over, and the rock beneath it is fractured by two tectonic plates colliding in real time. That is not a theory. That is what seismic mapping surveys conducted by Spanish and Moroccan geological teams confirmed during the 1990s, after decades of surface-level analysis had obscured just how structurally compromised the strait's floor actually is. Consider what that means for any structure that must sit there permanently. Every map you have ever seen of the Iberian Peninsula shows Spain and Morocco nearly touching at the southern tip, Tarifa on one side, Tangier on the other, separated by a gap. That looks almost accidental, as if a cartographer left a sliver of blue by mistake. The strait appears to be a shallow channel, something a previous era simply hadn't gotten around to crossing. You would expect, given a century of modern engineering and the ambition that built the Channel Tunnel, that this crossing would already exist. That expectation is precisely the problem. 900 meters of water depth is roughly equivalent to 3 Chrysler buildings, stacked fully submerged. At that depth, you operate in near total darkness, under pressures exceeding 90 atmospheres, 90 times the force pressing against every surface at sea level. Standard construction vessels cannot anchor effectively in those conditions. The canyon walls are not solid rock faces you can drill anchors into. They are fractured sedimentary layers, weakened by the same geological stresses that carved the canyon over millions of years. Stop and translate that into physical reality. The Strait of Gibraltar is not a simple channel between two continents. It is an active collision zone. The African plate and the Eurasian plate have been converging here for approximately 5 million years. The strait's floor is the scar of that convergence. A narrow band of fracture zones, submarine cliffs, and deformed sediment that has never settled into stability. The seismic surveys from the joint Spain-Morocco feasibility study found that the rock at the narrowest point is not only deep, but shattered at its foundations, with fault planes running at multiple angles through the canyon floor. What looked like the shortest route on every atlas is, in geological terms, the most structurally unstable location on this entire stretch of coastline. The irony is considerable. The crossing that appears obvious from space is the one that geology has rendered essentially impassable. That discovery should have ended the debate. It didn't, because the history of the Gibraltar crossing is also the history of at least one man who decided that if the strait was the obstacle, the logical solution was to remove the Mediterranean Sea entirely. What happens beneath the surface of the Strait of Gibraltar is not what most people picture when they imagine a sea crossing. The Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea do not simply meet here. They coincide. The Atlantic sits slightly higher and carries denser, colder water that flows eastward along the strait's floor at speeds reaching 8 knots, roughly the velocity of a fast-moving river, while lighter, warmer Mediterranean surface water flows westward above it. These two currents move in opposite directions simultaneously, separated by a halocline, which is the boundary layer between waters of different salinity, that shifts vertically with every tidal cycle. The result, in practical engineering terms, is a two-layered hydraulic machine running continuously 24 hours a day inside a fractured submarine canyon. At the strait's narrowest cross-section, underwater surveys have recorded what marine engineers describe as vertical mixing events, localized turbulence columns, where the two water masses exchange position abruptly, creating upwelling forces capable of displacing objects on the canyon floor. For any tunnel or submerged structure resting at that depth, these events are not a design consideration to be managed. They are a design disqualification. Consider what this means for construction logistics alone. A tunnel boring machine, the standard instrument for projects like the Channel Tunnel, must be positioned on the sea floor, maintained, supplied with materials, and operated by workers traveling through the tunnel under construction. Every one of those operations becomes exponentially more complex inside a canyon where currents can reverse direction and intensity within a single tidal cycle. The Channel Tunnel, become partisan, sits in stable chalk geology beneath relatively calm, shallow seas. The engineers who completed it in 1994 called it the engineering project of the century. The Gibraltar Strait presents conditions that make the Channel Tunnel's geology look cooperative by comparison. Now hold that picture: two hostile water masses, a fractured canyon floor, unpredictable hydraulic forces, and consider what a German architect named Hermann Skrgl proposed in 1929 as his solution. Skrgl's answer to the Gibraltar problem was not to cross it. It was to drain it. His project, which he called Atlantropa, proposed constructing a dam across the entire width of the strait. Not a bridge, not a tunnel, but a dam. And then allowing the Mediterranean Sea to evaporate and shrink by approximately 200 meters over several decades. The result would be a merged Europe-Africa landmass with millions of square kilometers of new habitable territory exposed from the former sea floor, connected by roads and railways where the Mediterranean had been. Skrgl was not a pamphleteer. He was a practicing architect who spent 2 decades, from 1929 to his death in 1952, promoting Atlantropa with detailed technical drawings, economic projections, and institutional lobbying. The proposal attracted serious attention from European engineers and urban planners. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, several major engineering associations discussed it formally. The dam itself, had it ever been attempted, would have been the largest structure built in human history, 14 kilometers wide, anchored to the Rock of Gibraltar on one end and the Moroccan coast on the other. The irony, of course, is that this structure would have required being built in exactly the location that geology had already deemed impossible. Skrgl died in 1952, struck by a bicycle in Munich, and died with him. But the question he had tried to circumvent, how do you cross a channel with an unstable floor and hostile hydraulics, remained unanswered. The next generation of engineers didn't try to remove the ocean. They tried to build above it. And what they proposed was, in its own way, just as extraordinary. In 1988, American architect Eugene Sui proposed what he described as the most elegant solution yet to the Gibraltar crossing problem. Not a conventional bridge, but a chain of artificial floating islands, self-sustaining platforms, anchored at intervals across the strait, connected by roadway and rail segments, each island large enough to serve as a rest stop and maintenance station. Sui's design was not impractical. In the way Skurgil's dam was impractical, the engineering principles behind it were defensible. Floating structures can survive conditions that fixed structures cannot, precisely because they move with the water rather than resist it. Several floating bridge systems built in sheltered Norwegian fjords have operated successfully for decades. The problem with Sui's proposal was not its physics, it was its price, $15 trillion. Let that number settle. Preliminary cost estimates for a floating island chain across the Strait of Gibraltar ranged between $12 and $15 trillion, roughly equivalent to the entire annual economic output of China at the time those estimates were produced. For a single infrastructure project, that figure ended the conversation before it truly began. But the floating island concept had surfaced something that the cost objection obscured. Whatever you build across this strait, it must be designed for what the ground beneath it is actively doing. And in the mid-1990s, a joint Spanish-Moroccan engineering commission discovered exactly what that ground was doing. The surveys were comprehensive seismic readings, sediment core sampling, and bathymetric mapping of the strait floor at a resolution not previously achieved. The data confirmed the canyon depth and fractured rock conditions already known from earlier studies. Then it added something that changed the entire engineering calculus permanently. An active fault line running beneath the strait floor at the narrow crossing, not a dormant geological scar, not a historical record, but a currently moving fault where the African plate is advancing northeast at approximately 4 millimeters per year, directly into the European continental shelf. 4 millimeters per year sounds negligible. Consider what it accumulates to over infrastructure time. Over a century, that movement equals 40 centimeters of lateral displacement beneath any fixed structure you anchor there. Over 5 centuries, within the design life expectation for major permanent infrastructure, it equals 2 full meters of plate movement in active tectonic zones. That kind of cumulative stress does not release gradually. It releases in seismic events. The 1755 Lisbon earthquake, one of the deadliest in recorded European history, which destroyed much of Portugal and sent tsunami waves across the Atlantic, was generated by fault movement in the same general plate boundary system. A tunnel or bridge at the narrow crossing would not merely face deep water and hostile currents. It would be built on top of a fault capable of producing magnitude 7 and magnitude 8 earthquakes, with no engineering precedent for how any fixed structure at that depth and in those geological conditions would survive such an event. The Commission's conclusion was unambiguous. The 14-kilometer route was not inadvisable. It was not viable. Under any known engineering methodology, at any realistic cost, for any projected design life. The irony that engineers had spent a century studying the wrong 14 kilometers is, in retrospect, almost elegant in its completeness. Every failed proposal, every rejected concept, every trillion-dollar price tag, all of it pointed to the same fractured, faulted, hydraulically hostile strip of seafloor. Nobody had looked carefully enough 28 kilometers to the west, not until 1995, but the most unsettling part is still ahead. Because the commission that closed the door on the narrow crossing also found something in the seismic data to the west, something that changed the question entirely. In 1995, the joint Spain-Morocco Feasibility Commission turned its seismic instruments westward along the strait floor, not because they expected to find a solution, but because the process of formally eliminating alternatives required mapping the entire geological corridor. What they found at the Camaranal threshold changed the project permanently. The Camaranal threshold is a submerged ridge, a natural geological shelf located approximately 28 kilometers west of the strait's narrowest point. It does not appear dramatically on standard nautical charts. It is not a feature you would identify as significant from a surface map, but the seismic data revealed something that stopped the Commission's analysis. At the threshold, the water depth is 284 meters, not 900, not 600, 284 meters, roughly the height of a single Eiffel Tower, not 3 stacked on each other. The longest route turned out to be the only viable route. More critically, the sediment layer covering the Camaranal threshold is deep layer clay stable, compressible, predictable material that tunnel engineers have worked with successfully in comparable projects worldwide. The fault density at the threshold is significantly lower than at the narrow crossing. The hydraulic conditions, while still demanding, fall within existing engineering parameters. The plan developed by Spain and Morocco through bilateral technical commissions since the early 2000s calls for 3 parallel tunnels at the Camarines threshold, 2 rail tunnels designed for high-speed trains and freight movement, and 1 central service and emergency access corridor. Total excavated length, approximately 38 kilometers, including approach ramps on both continental shelves. The tunnels are not designed to be rigid. They are designed to flex. This is the engineering principle the Gibraltar project shares with the Channel Tunnel, but extends significantly further. The Channel Tunnel's segmental lining system, the interlocking concrete rings forming the tunnel walls, absorbs minor ground movement without fracturing. The Gibraltar specification applies that same principle to an active seismic zone, using flexible coupling joints at regular intervals throughout the tunnel length, drawn directly from design approaches used in Japanese tunnels near plate boundaries in The economic implication of a completed crossing is not small. High-speed rail between Madrid and Casablanca, roughly 800 kilometers once the strait is bridged, would reduce journey times from the current ferry and road combination to approximately 4 hours. Direct freight rail between sub-Saharan Africa and Central Europe, bypassing sea routes for certain cargo corridors, would fundamentally alter how goods move between the 2 continents. 28 kilometers of tunnel would, in practical terms, connect 2 billion people. What took a century of proposals, failures, and 1 comprehensive geological survey to establish sounds almost self-evident. In retrospect, the viable crossing was never at the shortest distance. It was at the most stable geology, and the most stable geology had been waiting 28 kilometers away from where everyone was looking. What the Gibraltar crossing story reveals, when examined from geologic first principles, rather than from the perspective of frustrated engineers, is a lesson about the difference between apparent distance and viable distance. The 14-kilometer gap is real as a measurement. What it is not is a location, because a location is defined not only by its coordinates, but by the conditions governing those coordinates. The conditions at the strait's narrowest point include water depth nearly 10 times greater than the Camarines threshold, active tectonic faulting, a hydraulic regime hostile to construction at depth, and rock that is structurally compromised by the same plate collision that created the channel in the first place. The 28-kilometer route is not a compromise. It is the actual location of the crossing, the point where the physical preconditions for the project exist. This distinction underlies most of the major failures in the Gibraltar story. Skrgel's Atlantropa failed because it treated the ocean as an obstacle to be removed, rather than as a symptom of the geological reality beneath it. Sui's floating islands failed economically because they attempted to engineer around conditions that the Camarines threshold simply does not present. The 1990s Commission concluded correctly, not because its engineers were more capable than their predecessors, but because they finally had seismic instruments precise enough to read what the geology was actually saying. The flexible tunnel design, segmental lining with seismic-grade coupling joints, represents the final translation of that lesson into engineering practice. You do not build a rigid object in an active geological zone. You build something that moves with the earth rather than against it, what remains genuinely unresolved. And here is where current science reaches the boundary of its confidence, is the precise seismic risk profile at the Camarines threshold over a multi-century design life. The threshold sits in a lower risk zone than the narrow crossing, but it is not outside the influence of the same Atlantic-European plate boundary system that generated the 1755 Lisbon event. Current models suggest the threshold could sustain a magnitudes X earthquake at some point in its projected design life. The flexible tunnel specification is designed to survive that. Whether it can survive a magnitude 7.5 remains an active area of seismic research. Science hasn't settled that question yet, but the leading hypothesis, based on Japanese tunnel performance data from comparable seismic environments, points towards survivability. The project's funding timeline, meanwhile, remains the more immediate, open question. Bilateral agreements between Spain, Morocco, and the European Union are ongoing. The most recent joint technical reports project a realistic construction window beginning sometime between 2030 and 2040. What that means is that the most consequential infrastructure project in the history of the two continents is, right now, closer to reality than it has ever been, and still, as it has always been, dependent on human decisions made above a geological reality that has its own schedule entirely. What this century of failure and discovery ultimately reveals is not an indictment of engineering ambition. It is a portrait of how human beings negotiate with geological time. The planet operates on a timeline that makes infrastructure planning look like notes written on the back of a receipt. The African plate, moving 4 millimeters per year, has been making that movement for 5 million years, and it will continue making it long after any tunnel we build has ceased to function. The canyon at the strait's narrow crossing was not placed there to frustrate engineers. It is the visible record of a process so much older and so much larger than the civilization looking at it. And yet here is what the Camaranel threshold teaches. If you hold it carefully, the viable path was always there. The crossing did not require moving mountains or draining seas. It required knowing where to look and having the instruments to read what the Earth was actually showing. The image that stays, after all of it, is this. Two continents 14 kilometers apart, watching each other across a channel that has absorbed every clever plan aimed at it for 100 years, while 28 kilometers to the west, on a shallow clay ridge that barely registers on standard charts, the only real answer quietly waits. Some distances are not measured in kilometers. We're one layer deeper than when we started. Subscribe and follow this investigation wherever it leads.